Every so often, a video game is released that changes everything. Sometimes the game defines a new genre, and other times it redefines one. I can't think of a game that's better to explain this than Tetris. There were puzzle games before Tetris, but when it came along, it changed everything. Tetris is pure gameplay. There's no characters or story. Blocks just start appearing, and you have to figure out where to put them. Before long, the blocks reach the top of the screen, and it's game over. So many games were inspired by Tetris. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have Dr. Mario or Bejeweled. Another example is the survival horror genre. It was initially conceived with the game Alone in the Dark in 1992. Now some could argue that it's not the first survival horror game. However, it is the first that uses polygons and a 3D environment like we're used to seeing today. In Alone in the Dark, you start in an attic with no weapons in a haunted house. Your goal is to escape. 4 years later, Resident Evil was released for the PlayStation, and a lot of people either forgot about Alone in the Dark or never even knew about it. Many people consider Resident Evil in 1996 as the first survival horror game in the style that we know today. But Resident Evil owes a lot to Alone in the Dark. Despite the primitive graphics, they share a lot of traits. Resident Evil took a good idea and made it better. And that's what you do when you redefine a genre. You take existing ideas and some innovation of your own and make something even better. This leads me into talking about adventure video games. But to understand adventure games on the computer, we have to go back a little further. The fantasy tabletop role-playing game designed by Gary Gygax, the father of role-playing games, and Dave Arneson, is Dungeons & Dragons, released in 1974. Dungeons & Dragons inspired the first computer adventure game, Colossal Cave Adventure, in 1976. This was the first text-based adventure game on the computer. Colossal Cave Adventure inspired countless future endeavors in computer gaming and beyond. The goal of the game is to navigate the cave, find all the treasure, then safely leave the cave. This adventure game, as well as most adventure games for the next decade, would use text parsers. A text parser is simply a computer's way of accepting commands from the player. Then it turns those commands into something it can understand. I'll use a key as an example in a video game. Let's say there's a key sitting on a table and you want to take it. So you might type, "take the key," but another player might want to get it, so they would type, "get the key." Now, inherently, these are the same two functions. It doesn't really matter whether you take it or get it, but it does to a computer because it doesn't understand the difference between the two words. The more vocabulary a game has been programmed with, and more complicated a story gets, the more detailed the parser has to be written to account for all the possible words a player might type. That's not even getting into the fact that not everyone's first language is English. These early interactive fiction adventure games were all text-based, so every word mattered to describe the environment your character was in, as well as how to interact in it. If people misspelled a word when they were typing into the computer, it wouldn't know what to do. Or if they used unexpected words that weren't programmed for use in the parser. I know I'm making a really big deal about this, but it really was a big deal in its time. Also, parsers could be simplified, so if you wanted to take the key, you could simplify it to take key. Oftentimes, these commands would be simplified to 1 or 2 word inputs, so talking to a computer is actually very similar to talking to a toddler. You wouldn't tell them a very long, complicated sentence, you would just narrow it down to the keywords. But the programmers had to deal with guessing what people would use as their keywords. Sometimes games would come with manuals telling you the various keywords that you could use to put you on the correct path through the game. But what if you lost the manual, or it didn't come with one, or you were borrowing the game from someone? You didn't always have those inputs and needed to guess. A lot of gamers would simply give up out of frustration with these types of games. After all, everything that's happening is text on a screen. So unless you're sitting there taking notes and mapping your progress, it was easy to miss something, especially if you didn't finish the game in one sitting. Some of these games were huge, and it would take you days or weeks to get through them. Another genre of game that Colossal Cave Adventure inspired was MUD, or Multi-User Dungeon. MUDs were multiplayer, real-time virtual worlds in text. They could have elements of role-playing games, player versus player, online chatting, and so on. Games similar in design to World of Warcraft, EverQuest, and Ultima Online used to be called graphical MUDs, before they were given the term Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game, or MMORPG for short, a term coined in 1997. Many MMORPG developers began as MUD developers. The popular game RuneScape, for example, started out as a text-based MUD before graphics were added in early development. Another game that was heavily influenced by Colossal Cave Adventure was Zork from 1979. Many people who are unaware of adventure considered Zork the first adventure text-based game. Zork was created by 4 students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, better known as MIT. Originally, Zork and Adventure were both written for the PDP-10, a room-sized computer mainframe that was popular with universities in the late 1970s. Adventure was written in a very common programming language called Fortran, but Zork was written with MDL, a more specialized language that wasn't as popular. So the only way to play Zork was to log on remotely to the MIT PDP-10 through ARPANET, an early version of the internet, usually from another university. Another problem for Zork was its size. The creators at the time were very ambitious. Since the game was too big to operate on early home computers, they had to break it into 3 parts. Zork Parts 1, 2, and 3. Although Zork was first released for the TRS-80 computer, it was eventually ported to just about every home computer, like the Apple II, Atari computers, and the IBM PC, or personal computer. It was a big hit, selling over 1 million copies. Now let me explain about hardware and software limitations before getting back to game releases. In 2018, we have 3 major consoles, 2 types of mobile devices, and personal computers with 3 major operating systems. In the 1970s and early 1980s, it wasn't so defined. Many people did not have personal computers. There were no gaming-capable cell phones like today, and home consoles were very limited in the cartridges available to them. Your cell phone is more powerful than any computer that existed back then by a ridiculous amount. Plus, with the power of the internet, you can easily download games from online stores or play online games with your friends. When someone made a personal computer game back then, oftentimes it was sold through the mail on the emerging floppy disk technology. Computer hardware could vary wildly between models, and there were few, if any, standards between them. Home computers started to gain popularity with the release of the Apple II home computer in 1977. The list of manufacturers, models, and clones trying to also make microcomputers after Apple II's success is immense. Computers now generally operate off of Microsoft Windows, Apple's Mac OS, and various releases of Linux. Prior to what we use today, there was no standard. Dozens of programming languages on as many operating systems, spanning hundreds of models of computers, came and went in a relatively short amount of time. Some game programmers would even write their own languages if the current languages available didn't meet their needs. The point is that without standardized hardware and software like home consoles had, programming games on computers for consumers was challenging to say the least. Eventually, static images started becoming popular to accompany the text, but they usually held very few details and did little more than set the scene for the player so they could get a little more immersed than text only. It also allowed the creators to visually express their worlds and ideas. That was until everything changed once again with the 1984 release of King's Quest. But even King's Quest didn't start from nothing. The designer of King's Quest, Roberta Williams, was inspired to create adventure games after she and her husband played through Colossal Cave Adventure. After completing the game, they began searching for more adventure games, but found the market underdeveloped. So they started working on a game called Mystery House for their company Online Systems. They incorporated the company the following year into Sierra Online, which would become a major gaming corporation for the next 2 decades. But back to King's Quest. It's the story of King Graham. It was the first game that animated the main character on screen, interacting with objects, other characters, and the environment. The character made their way through the game, solving puzzles, using items that they found and stored in their inventory, traversing inhospitable environments, and using all of their senses to experience things around them for clues, like sight, smell, and touch. The player, armed with a controllable character, could navigate the environment using their keyboard instead of commands like go north or go east. The game did still use a parser to command the character to pick up objects, open doors, and the like, but the graphical interface was much more immersive and you no longer had to navigate with typed commands. King's Quest was heavily influenced by the text-based adventure games before it, but like Resident Evil 2 Alone in the Dark, it took a good idea, added new concepts, and redefined the genre. Before diving into the next part of adventure game innovation, let's talk narrative. After all, what good are puzzles and environment if you don't care about what the character's going through? Adventure games are like interactive novels, and that leads us to the series of books that also emerged at this time, Choose Your Own Adventure. These books were highly successful, and you could find them everywhere in the 1980s and 90s. Choose Your Own Adventure is a series of children's books written in a second-person point of view, so that the reader is the protagonist living the story. In the stories, you could be a spy, a mountain climber, a private investigator, and much more. The typical format was, every couple of pages you would face 2 or 3 options as to where the story would go next. Your choice would lead you to various pages around the book. While it sounds formulaic, the authors got very creative in their approach. Some titles could have more than 40 possible endings, while others had less than 10. There's also no clear pattern or ratio of good to bad endings. This sense of unpredictability enticed the reader to want to try again and see what other endings they could discover by making different choices. In one of the books, Inside UFO 5440, there's an ending that can only be reached by cheating and turning to a wrong page by accident. In another book, The Race Forever, you could potentially get into an endless looping storyline. Back in the world of video games, countless games were inspired by the innovation of King's Quest's graphical parser style. Sierra Online would go on to make other successful franchises in the coming years: Space Quest, Police Quest, and the hilarious Leisure Suit Larry series, just to name a few. While Sierra Online dominated the market, other companies took notice and jumped on board. These included larger developers like Lucasfilm Games, later renamed to LucasArts, as well as smaller developers like the Hugo's House of Horrors trilogy that started much later in 1990 and was inspired by Leisure Suit Larry. Now let's take a step back for one moment and get some perspective. Colossal Cave Adventure, or simply Adventure from 1976, was the first computer adventure game, and it was text only. Mystery House in 1980 was the first adventure game with graphics, so now that leads us to the next subgenre of adventure titles, the point-and-click games. It began with Enchanted Scepters in 1984 on Macintosh computers. You might be wondering why it took so long for computers to use a mouse to control games when it's so common now. The mouse was developed all the way back in 1964, but it would wait 20 years for the release of the Macintosh 128K, simply called the Apple Macintosh, to include a mouse. While mice were available as optional peripherals on other computers, because it was included, as well as a graphical user interface or GUI operating system, the mouse was an instant hit. Enchanted Scepters was also the first game for the Macintosh to have digitized sound, yet another advancement to help the player feel more immersed. The gameplay is similar to a text adventure game. The screen shows a picture of the room the player's currently in, and to the right is a description of the room. While there's no movement in the graphics, enemies do come and go, and the player can interact with objects in the environment. You can also navigate to other rooms using a drop-down menu. While this game doesn't look nearly as good as King's Quest that came out the same year, it was the innovation of Control that inspired others to start thinking about developing future games in that direction. Now, I only covered some of the high points in the history of adventure games, but I hope you found it interesting. If you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future videos. Next time, I'll be reviewing a game from the point-and-click genre that's my personal favorite.